close your eyes, breathe, and listen. Long before the great walls of Troy ever fell, before 1,000 ships were ever launched, there was a child who came into this world screaming not from fear, but as if already angry at what the fates had written for him. His name was Achilles, and from the very first breath he drew, the universe itself could not quite decide what to do with him. He was born at the edge of 2 worlds. His father was Peleus, a mortal man, a king of the Myrmidons of Phthia in Thessaly, a man respected and weathered by war, a man who smelled of horses and salt wind and honest earth. But his mother was something else entirely. Her name was Thetis, and she was a Nereid, one of the 50 daughters of the ancient sea god Nereus, a silver creature of the deep ocean who could change her shape like water changes the shape of any vessel it fills. Imagine that union for a moment as you let your breathing slow. A mortal king and an immortal sea nymph, flesh and foam, earth and ocean. 2 natures that should never have touched, pressed together by the strange and often cruel machinery of divine will. For the gods of Olympus had decreed it. Zeus himself had commanded that Thetis must marry a mortal man, despite her immortal heart, despite her ancient blood. The reasons were both cold and practical. There had been a prophecy, a whisper from the fates themselves, that any son born of Thetis would grow to surpass his father in greatness. And Zeus, ever careful of his throne, had no desire to produce such a son himself. So Thetis was given to Peleus, and in time she bore him a boy. The gods came to the wedding, all of them shining and enormous and careless in the way that only immortals can be careless. They brought gifts of gold and sacred fire and divine song. But even then, on the happiest day, trouble arrived uninvited. A golden apple was thrown among the goddesses, inscribed with 3 words that would eventually unravel the peace of the entire ancient world. For the fairest. 3 goddesses reached for it. From that single moment of divine vanity, the seeds of the Trojan War were planted, long before Achilles could even walk. But we are not yet there. We are still at the beginning. We are still in Phthia, in the cool night air of Thessaly, where a silver-haired goddess holds her infant son and already knows what is coming. Thetis loved Achilles the way the sea loves the shore, completely, furiously, and with the full knowledge that she would one day destroy what she adored. For she knew, from the moment she first looked into his gray eyes, what the fates had written for him. The Moirai, those 3 ancient sisters who spin and measure and cut the thread of every life, had been mercilessly clear. Her son would be given a choice. He could live a long, quiet, forgettable life far from war and glory, growing old and soft and lost to history's memory, like a stone that sinks slowly into river silt. Or he could go to war, blaze across the world like a comet, be spoken of forever, and die young, so terribly, heartbreakingly young. What does a mother do with such a prophecy? Thetis did what any mother would do. She refused it. She fought it with every power available to her. And so in those first tender months of his life, she carried her infant son down to the River Styx. Now let me tell you about the Styx because it matters. In the ancient Greek understanding of the world, the Styx was not merely a river. It was the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead, the dark waters that wound 9 times around the underworld of Hades. It was the river by which even the gods swore their most unbreakable oaths because its waters held a power older than Olympus itself. To be touched by the Styx was to be touched by something primal and permanent and absolute. Thetis held her son by the ankle, that small, perfect, soft ankle, and she lowered him into those cold, dark, sacred waters. She dipped him slowly, carefully, the way you might lower a precious and irreplaceable thing into something vast and unknown. She held her breath. The waters closed around him, silver and black and ancient, and she felt the power of the Styx flow through his skin, through his muscles, through his young bones, through every cell of his growing body. Invulnerability seeping into him like ink into cloth. When she lifted him out, the water streamed from him in silver rivulets, and he looked at her with those gray eyes, calm now, as if he understood something, as if some part of him, some deep, wordless animal part, already understood everything. But his ankle, the ankle she had held, had never touched the water. It was the only part of him left mortal, the only place where the darkness could enter. A single point of fragility in a body that was otherwise as close to divine as a human frame could be. Thetis knew this. She must have known. And yet she could not bring herself to let go, to release him fully into those black waters and risk losing him to the current, to the underworld's cold hunger. The paradox of her love became his only vulnerability. She protected him so fiercely that the protection itself became a flaw. This is the nature of love, isn't it? Even divine love, even the love of a goddess for a half-divine son. It contains within itself the thing it most fears. In the ancient sources, in the works of the great poets, in the libraries of Alexandria before they burned, in the clay tablets and crumbling scrolls that archaeologists have pieced together like broken mosaics, this story of the River Styx appears in the later mythological tradition, most clearly preserved by the Roman poet Statius in his Achilles, written in the 1st century of the Common Era. Homer himself, in the Iliad, does not mention the Styx dipping, but the invulnerability of Achilles is woven into everything, assumed, present in the very way he moves through battle like a force of nature rather than a man. The later tradition merely gave the legend its most vivid image, the image that has endured through 20 centuries of retelling: a mother, an ankle, a dark river, and love that cannot let go. After the river, Thetis tried other methods. She sought teachers, protectors, shields of a different kind. She brought the boy to Chiron. Say that name quietly in your mind, Chiron, and feel how different it sounds from the other names of this story. Because Chiron was different. He was a centaur, half man, half horse, but not the wild, drunken, violent centaurs of other myths. Chiron was the oldest and wisest of his kind, a creature of remarkable gentleness and impossible knowledge. He lived on Mount Pelion, in a cave fragrant with herbs and wood smoke and old leather, and he had already tutored heroes before Achilles came to him. Jason, who would seek the golden fleece, had sat at Chiron's knee. Asclepius, who would become the god of medicine, had learned the healing arts from his hands. And now this silver-haired child, this half-mortal, half-divine boy, with the fierce grey eyes and the strange quiet at the center of him. Now he came to Chiron too. Picture that cave on the mountainside. Picture the fire low and orange in the evening, the smell of pine resin and wild thyme, the sound of wind moving through the upper slopes, and in that firelight a centaur, enormous and brown and warm-eyed, teaching a small boy how to run, how to hold a bow, how to read the stars, how to know which plants would heal a wound and which would deepen it. Chiron taught Achilles medicine and music in equal measure, because he understood something that the warriors of the age often forgot, that the capacity to heal and the capacity to harm lived in the same hands, and only wisdom could teach a man which power to reach for in any given moment. Achilles learned quickly. He always learned quickly. There was something in him, some bright, burning, impatient intelligence that consumed knowledge the way fire consumes dry wood. He ran faster than the other children, faster even than the horses of Pelion. He could shoot an arrow with a stillness that seemed uncanny in someone so young, his whole body becoming momentarily quiet, the brightness in him folding inward, and then release. He played the lyre in the evenings, sitting near the cave entrance with the mountain falling away below him and the Aegean glittering in the distance. And the music he made was not gentle music. It was the kind of music that made you feel the world was larger than you had believed, and sadder, and more beautiful. He was happy on that mountain, or something close to happy, as close as Achilles ever came to a feeling that didn't also contain its opposite. But Thetis watched from the sea below, and the prophecy watched with her, and the years moved forward the way years always do, quietly, relentlessly, indifferent to what anyone wanted. When Achilles was still young, the sources disagree on the exact age, and we should be comfortable with that uncertainty, as all honest historians must be. Thetis received word that the war she had always feared was drawing near. It had begun, as it always had to begin, with that golden apple and the vanity of goddesses, and the weakness of a Trojan prince named Paris, who chose beauty over wisdom when a goddess offered him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Helen of Sparta was taken, stolen, or chosen, depending on whose side you believe, and her husband Menelaus, his face white with fury and humiliation, called on every king in Greece to honor their ancient oath and take her back. And so the great gathering began. Ships were built, armies assembled, swords were sharpened, and word came to the oracle at Delphi, where the smoke rose from the sacred cracks in the earth, and the Pythia spoke in riddles and certainties. The Greeks would never take Troy without Achilles. Without Achilles. Thetis heard it, and the sea around her went still. She could not stop the war. She was a goddess, but even gods could not unravel what the fates had already woven. But she could try, one last time, with the desperate creativity of a mother's love, to hide her son from it. And so she did something that would become one of the most beloved and peculiar episodes in all of ancient mythology. She disguised Achilles as a girl. Hear me now, because this detail is important, not simply as legend or as charming story, but as a window into the ancient world's understanding of identity and destiny. Thetis dressed her son in women's clothing and brought him to the court of King Lycomedes on the island of Scyros, where he lived among the king's daughters as one of them. He was given a woman's name. Some sources say Pyrrha, for his reddish gold hair, and he moved through the women's quarters of the palace, learning their ways, speaking their language of gesture and glance and domestic rhythm. He also fell in love. Her name was Deidamia, the eldest daughter of Lycomedes, and she was not deceived by the disguise, or perhaps she chose not to be. In the privacy of that sheltered world, Achilles and Deidamia found each other, and from their union a son was conceived and born, a boy named Neoptolemus, who would one day follow his father's path into legend, though that story belongs to other knights. But Odysseus was coming. Clever Odysseus, king of Ithaca, the man whose mind worked like water, finding every crack, flowing through every obstacle. He had been sent to find Achilles because the Greeks needed him, because the oracle had spoken, because Troy could not fall without the swiftest and most terrible warrior in the world. And Odysseus had a gift for finding things that did not want to be found. He arrived at Scyros with a merchant's disguise and a merchant's goods, bolts of cloth and jewels and delicate things that the women of the court gathered around eagerly. But hidden among these gifts were weapons, a shield, a spear, a sword. The women murmured and admired the cloths, and then one of them, one girl taller than the others, with hands that were slightly too large and shoulders that were slightly too broad, reached past the silk and the jewels and picked up the sword. Picked it up the way you pick up something familiar, the way you come home. Odysseus smiled. The disguise was over. The hiding was over. The long, quiet years on Pelion and Scyros were over. Achilles stood there in his women's robes with a sword in his hand and something in his face, some last remainder of the peaceful boy on the mountainside, went still and serious and resolute. He had known, perhaps, that this moment was always coming. Perhaps some part of him, the part that was his mother's son, had hoped it wouldn't. But the other part, the part that was Peleus's son, the part that had always run a little faster, pulled the bowstring a little tighter, played the lyre a little louder than the moment seemed to require. That part had been waiting. He went with Odysseus. He did not go reluctantly. He went the way water goes when a dam breaks. Suddenly, completely, without looking back at what it is leaving behind. Thetis stood in the sea below and watched the ships grow small on the horizon, and the waves around her were very dark and very cold and very quiet. The fleet assembled at Aulis, hundreds of ships, thousands of men, a great noisy creaking city of wood and canvas, and iron stretched along the harbor. Kings came from every corner of Greece. Agamemnon the commander, broad-shouldered and imperious, who would prove to be both the greatest strength and greatest weakness of the Greek cause. Menelaus, his brother, the wronged husband, quieter than his reputation. Ajax the Great, enormous and steady as a standing stone. Diomedes, brilliant and fearless. Odysseus, always slightly apart from the others, watching. And Achilles. He brought with him his Myrmidons, the soldiers of his Thessalian kingdom, disciplined and fierce and loyal in the way that men are loyal to someone who has never once asked anything of them that he would not do himself. And he brought with him his dearest companion, his other self, a young man named Patroclus. Patroclus deserves his own quiet moment here, because he is essential to everything that follows. In the ancient sources, particularly in Homer's Iliad, the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus is rendered with such intimacy, such tenderness, such terrible weight, that it has been interpreted and debated and cherished across every century since. Were they lovers? Were they companions of a sacred and particular bond that the ancient Greeks understood differently than we do today? Were they simply friends in the deepest sense, the sense that makes simply an almost absurd word? Homer does not specify. He does not need to. He shows us instead a man who refuses to eat when his companion is grieving, a man who goes to war not for glory, but because his dearest friend has been dishonored, a man whose death unmakes another man completely. Patroclus had come to Phthia as a young boy under difficult circumstances. He had accidentally killed another child in a quarrel, and in the custom of the time, his father had sent him away to be raised in the household of King Pelias, far from home, under the shadow of his mistake. Achilles had been given to him as a companion, and somehow, in the way that children find each other across all barriers of background and circumstance, they had become inseparable. Chiron had taught them both on the mountain. They had grown up side by side. Now they sailed together toward Troy, toward the thing that waited for them at the end of all that blue and shining water. Let your breath steady now. Feel the gentle rocking of a ship on a calm sea. The smell of salt and pine tar. The sound of oars moving in slow rhythm. Stars above, very bright, the way they are only over open ocean. The coast of Greece falling away behind you, and ahead, somewhere beyond the curve of the world, the glittering towers of a city that would give its name to the greatest war in the ancient Western imagination. Troy did not look from a distance like a city worth dying for. That is the first thing you must understand, and it is something the ancient sources hint at, quietly, between the lines of their epic verse. When the Greek fleet finally rounded the headland and the coast of Asia Minor appeared through the morning haze, what they saw was not a fairy tale fortress glowing with impossible gold. What they saw was a real city. A large city, certainly, larger than most of the cities the Greek commanders had left behind, sitting on a broad, windy plain between two rivers, the Scamander and the Simois, with its famous walls rising perhaps 9 or 10 meters at their highest. The walls were real stone and real mortar. The plain before them was real mud, real grass, real space where men would bleed. The Greeks beached their ships and made their camp along the shore, a vast, sprawling, uncomfortable city of canvas and cooking fires and argument, stretching for miles along the Trojan coastline. It would be their home for 10 years. Most of them did not know this yet. Most of them believed they would be back in Greece before the next harvest. They were not. Now, the ancient chronology of the Trojan War is a fascinating puzzle that historians and archaeologists have spent centuries assembling. And honestly, while your breathing slows, let me tell you something real and wonderful about this. Troy was not merely myth. Heinrich Schliemann, a 19th century German businessman turned obsessive archaeologist, went looking for Homer's Troy with the Iliad as his map. He dug at a hill called Hisarlik on the northwestern coast of modern Turkey, and what he found astonished the world. Not one Troy, but many. 9 cities, one built upon the ruins of the last, layered through thousands of years of human habitation. The layer that most scholars now associate with the Troy of the Homeric War, Troy 7a, in archaeological nomenclature, shows evidence of destruction by fire and violence sometime around 1180 BCE. Real walls, real fire, real catastrophe. This means that somewhere beneath the history and the legend and the poetry, there is a truth. Something happened on that plain. Men really did fight there, and it is entirely possible, walking softly on the available evidence, that somewhere in the chaos of the late Bronze Age collapse, a man of extraordinary ability walked across that same ground, and his story was so remarkable that it became the nucleus around which an entire civilization's understanding of heroism, mortality, and glory was built. Let that settle in your chest for a moment. The ground was real, the walls were real, and perhaps, the man was real too. But tonight we are not yet in the 10th year of the war, the year that Homer chooses as his starting point in the Iliad. Tonight we move through time more gently, the way a river moves through landscape, touching everything, changing everything, but never rushing. We will pass through the early years of the war the way you pass through the early hours of a night, half conscious, half dreaming, aware that time is moving, even though it feels still. In those first years, the war had its own rhythm. The Greeks could not simply march up to the walls of Troy and knock them down. The city was well provisioned, well defended, and supported by allies who came from across Asia Minor and beyond. The Dardanians, the Lycians, the Mysians, the Thracians, kingdoms and peoples whose names are mostly dust now, but who were very real then, very present, very willing to fight. The Trojans under their great king Priam and his formidable sons, Hector above all, the eldest and most capable, could hold their walls indefinitely. The Greeks needed to cut off supply lines, raid the surrounding countryside, starve the city into submission. And for this work, for the brutal, grinding, necessary work of raiding and burning and breaking the support structures of an enemy, there was no one better than Achilles. In those early years, he was everywhere. He led his Myrmidons on raid after raid across the Troad, the region around Troy. Ancient sources, fragments and references preserved in later compilations, in Apollodorus, in Quintus of Smyrna's post-Homerica, credit him with destroying 11 cities by sea and 12 by land in the years before the Iliad begins. 23 cities. Think about that number as your body grows heavier, as your eyes grow heavier. 23 separate military campaigns, each one requiring planning, courage, execution, the management of men under pressure and fear. Each one a fire in the night, a city's wealth brought back to the Greek camp, a contribution to the slow strangulation of Troy. He was efficient in the way that forces of nature are efficient, not calculating, not cold, but absolute, complete. When Achilles decided a thing, the thing was done. And in the doing of it, he became a legend while he was still living. The men in the Greek camp talked about him the way people talk about weather, with a combination of awe and relief that the thunder was aimed elsewhere today. The Trojans on their walls watched his golden armor catch the sun on the plain and felt something that was not quite fear and not quite wonder, but something that lived in between. In those years, too, the gods took sides. This is where the story becomes deliciously complicated, with the particular complication of a world in which divine beings have opinions, preferences, grudges, and favorites, and act on all of these with complete disregard for fairness or proportion. The gods of Olympus divided along the lines that the golden apple had drawn. Hera and Athena supported the Greeks, furious at Paris for his judgment. Aphrodite and Apollo supported the Trojans. Aphrodite for obvious reasons. Apollo because Troy was his beloved city, the place he had helped to build. Poseidon shifted. Ares was unreliable. Zeus attempted to maintain a kind of difficult neutrality that satisfied no one, least of all Thetis, who had her own requests to make of him. And Achilles moved through all of this divine machinery like what? Like a man, perhaps. Like a man who was almost divine but not quite, and who felt the gap between what he was and what he could have been with every breath. The gods could not kill him, could barely touch him, but they could arrange circumstances. They could move pieces on the board. They could put into motion the chain of events that would eventually lead to the single moment that Homer places at the very center of his epic, the moment when Achilles, in fury and pride and pain, withdrew from the war and nearly destroyed everything. To understand that moment, the moment the Iliad opens with, the rage, the menace that Homer names in his very first word, you must understand something about the Greek world's concept of honor. The Greek word is time, and it means something both simpler and more complex than our modern English word honor can quite capture. It means worth, value, the public acknowledgement of what a person is. In a society without banks or credit scores or professional titles, time was literally a man's social currency. It was expressed through gifts, through prizes won in battle, through the acknowledgement of peers and commanders. To take a man's time, to diminish it publicly, to strip away the visible signs of his worth, was not merely an insult. It was an act of violence. It was a reduction of the man's very self. And Agamemnon, the commander of the Greek forces, brilliant, powerful, deeply flawed Agamemnon, stripped Achilles' time in the most public and cutting way imaginable. Here is what happened, and it is one of the most precisely rendered human conflicts in all of ancient literature. A priest of Apollo named Chryses came to the Greek camp to ransom his daughter, Chryseis, who had been taken as a war prize and given to Agamemnon. He came with gold and with the sacred symbols of the god, asking humbly, respectfully, for the return of his child. The Greek soldiers were moved. It is a human moment. An old man come for his daughter, and they urged Agamemnon to accept the ransom. Agamemnon refused. He sent the priest away with harsh words. Apollo, deeply displeased, sent a plague. For 9 days, arrows of sickness fell invisibly through the Greek camp. Men died of fever, of infection, of the particular horror of dying slowly in a military camp far from home, surrounded by fire smoke and other men suffering. The pyres burned night and day. The army weakened. On the 10th day, Achilles called an assembly. He spoke directly, as he always spoke, without the diplomatic circumlocution that Odysseus or Nestor might have employed, but with the clean, uncomfortable force of someone who believes that truth should be said plainly. He proposed consulting the oracle, finding the cause of the plague. A seer named Calchas, who knew what the gods were thinking, rose to speak. But first he asked for protection. He was afraid, and not without reason, of powerful men who do not like what truth has to say about them. Achilles guaranteed his safety, and Calchas told the truth. The plague was Apollo's anger at Agamemnon's treatment of Chryseis. The girl must be returned. Agamemnon was furious. He agreed to return Chryseis. He had to, with the plague eating his army. But he announced publicly, in front of every king and commander and common soldier in that assembly, that he would take Achilles' own war prize in compensation. A young woman named Briseis, who had been given to Achilles after one of his raids, given to him as the visible symbol of his worth, his time, his public recognition as the greatest warrior in the Greek army. He was going to take her back. Feel the quality of the silence that followed that announcement. Feel it the way you feel a sudden change in air pressure before a storm. The Greeks standing in that assembly understood, all of them, exactly what had just happened. Agamemnon had not merely made a logistical decision. He had declared publicly and irreversibly that he valued his own comfort above Achilles' honor. He had reduced the greatest warrior in the Greek world to a subordinate whose possessions existed at the commander's pleasure. Achilles' hand went to his sword. It stayed there for a long, terrible moment. Homer tells us that the goddess Athena appeared at that instant, invisible to everyone else, visible only to Achilles, and took him by his golden hair and held him back. She spoke to him quietly, urgently. Restrain yourself. The words of fury are enough. Insults can be answered with words that cut deeper than swords. Your time will come." Achilles breathed. His hand released the sword hilt, and instead he spoke. And what he said, in the Iliad, is one of the great sustained passages of ancient literature. He stripped Agamemnon bare with words. He named every truth that Agamemnon would have preferred unspoken. The fact that he, Achilles, did most of the fighting while Agamemnon took most of the prizes. The fact that Troy was no quarrel of his, that no Trojan had ever harmed him or his family, that he had come here for Agamemnon's brother's stolen wife and received nothing but diminishment in return. He threw down his golden staff, the symbol of authority in a Greek assembly, and swore an oath by it. A day would come when the Greeks would need Achilles desperately, when they would search for him and find him absent. And on that day, Agamemnon would understand exactly what he had thrown away. Then he withdrew. He took his myrmidons back to their ships at the far end of the beach, and he sat down at the water's edge, and he wept. This is a detail that stops modern readers in their tracks, and perhaps it should stop us here too, in the comfortable darkness of this hour. Achilles wept. The greatest warrior in the world sat down at the edge of the sea and wept, not from weakness, but from the particular anguish of someone who has been made to feel worthless by the one person whose acknowledgement mattered most in that context. Honor societies work like this. The opinion of the community is not peripheral. It is constitutive of who you are. His mother heard him. Of course she did. She was the sea, or something very like it, and her son's tears fell into the water she inhabited. Thetis rose from the waves, silver and sorrowing, and sat beside him. And he told her everything, and she held him the way she had held him above the River Styx, trying to protect him from something she could not stop. She promised to go to Zeus. She promised to ask the king of the gods to give the Trojans victory, to let the Greeks suffer without Achilles, to let them feel his absence in their wounds and their deaths, until Agamemnon's pride broke and he acknowledged what he had done. And Zeus agreed. He nodded, that slow, terrible Olympus-shaking nod that bound even a god's will, and the machinery of consequence was set in motion. What followed in the military history of the Trojan War, as Homer presents it, was a long and brutal education for the Greek army. Without Achilles, they were still formidable. They had Ajax, Diomedes, Odysseus, Menelaus. But without Achilles, there was no one to anchor the terror of the Trojans, no one at whom even the bravest Trojan warriors looked and felt that particular cold certainty that today was not the day to push forward. Without that presence on the battlefield, the balance shifted. The Trojans came out from behind their walls. Hector led them, great Hector, the best of them, the man whom Homer treats with a sympathy and complexity unusual for an enemy in an epic of this kind. Hector was not a villain. He was a man who understood exactly what was at stake and fought for it with everything he had: his city, his wife Andromache, his infant son Astyanax, his father Priam, his brothers, the entire world he had grown up in. When Homer shows us Hector reaching for his baby son, and the child crying at the terrifying horsehair plume of his father's helmet, and Hector laughing and lifting the helmet off, and the baby reaching for him, this is not sentiment. This is a writer making sure that you understand who the Trojans are, that you grieve for both sides equally. The Greeks were pushed back toward their ships. Great battles were fought. The Iliad describes them in magnificent, almost hypnotic detail. The kind of detail that suggests someone who had either witnessed warfare or spoken at length with those who had. The dust that turned to mud with blood. The sound of bronze on bronze that was felt in the teeth as much as heard. The particular exhaustion of a man who has been fighting since dawn and the sun is still high. Through all of it, Achilles sat by his ships. He sat and he waited, and he played his lyre. Homer gives us this image: the greatest warrior in the world, in the middle of a war, playing music on the beach while his comrades bled and died on the plain. It is one of the most quietly devastating images in all of ancient poetry. He played music about the deeds of heroes. He was a hero, refusing to be heroic, because the one whose acknowledgement made heroism meaningful had taken that acknowledgement away. Patroclus was with him. Patient, gentle Patroclus, who listened to the music and watched the smoke rise from the battlefield and said nothing, because there was nothing yet to say. But inside him, something was gathering, something that would eventually break both of them. Embassies came. Agamemnon, finally frightened enough, sent men to Achilles with offers, extraordinary offers, almost humiliating in their generosity. 7 bronze tripods, 10 talents of gold, 20 shining cauldrons, 12 prize-winning horses, 7 women of Lesbos. And Briseis returned untouched with an oath sworn before the gods. And eventually, if Troy fell, Achilles could fill his own ship with gold and choose any one of Agamemnon's daughters to marry, with a dowry that would shame kings. Achilles refused. This refusal is one of the most fascinating and debated moments in all of ancient literature. Why? The prizes were extraordinary. The humiliation of Agamemnon in the offer of them was almost complete. What was Achilles waiting for? He told the ambassadors, and it is important to hear his exact reasoning, that he had been given a choice. The choice his mother had told him about since he was old enough to understand words. A long life and obscurity, or glory and an early death. And until this moment, he told them, he had chosen glory. He had accepted the terms of the short, brilliant life. But Agamemnon had shown him something, had shown him that the glory he was earning with his life was not really his. It could be taken. It could be stripped away by any man with more power and less conscience. And if that was what glory was, then perhaps it was not worth the price he was paying for it. He said he was going home. He did not go home, because Patroclus was still there, watching the smoke rise from the plain, and soon the smoke would be much closer, and the choice that Achilles thought he was still making was already, in every meaningful sense, being made for him by the machinery of love and loyalty that he had built his whole life upon. Let me tell you what happens next. The Trojans, emboldened, broke through the Greek defenses and reached the ships, the long, beautiful wooden ships that were the Greeks' only way home, drawn up on the beach and now threatened with fire. Real fire. The kind of fire that ends things. There is no return from Troy without ships. There is no story, no glory, no going home if the ships burn. Patroclus went to Achilles. He stood before him, this gentle, patient man who had loved Achilles since they were children on a mountain. And he wept. And then through his tears he asked for something. He asked not for Achilles to return to battle. He understood by now that Achilles could not be asked that the wound was too deep, the pride too absolutely engaged. But he asked for something else. He asked to wear Achilles' armor, his divine armor, forged by the god Hephaestus himself, gleaming and terrible, and recognizable from a mile away on any battlefield. He asked to put it on and lead the Myrmidons out, not as himself, but as the appearance of Achilles, the shadow of Achilles, enough to break the Trojan momentum, to push them back from the ships, to buy time. Achilles hesitated, and in that hesitation, that terrible, pivotal hesitation, you can hear the entire tragedy turning on its hinge. He agreed. He put his own hands on his own armor and dressed Patroclus in it. Each piece, each strap, each bronze clasp. He warned him, drive them back from the ships, then stop. Do not pursue them to the walls of Troy. Go only so far, and then return. Do not try to be me. Patroclus nodded. He put the helmet on. The horsehair plume moved in the sea wind. He walked out onto the plain, and the Trojans saw him and felt the floor of their certainty shift beneath them, because to them that armor meant one thing and one thing only. It meant Achilles had returned. It meant the ground itself was about to become hostile. The Trojan advance fractured and rolled back like a wave that has met something it cannot overcome. The Myrmidons poured out behind their borrowed commander, and Patroclus fought, Homer tells us, brilliantly, furiously, as if he were trying to prove something to someone, or perhaps to prove it to himself. He drove the Trojans back. He pushed them away from the ships. He saved the fleet. And then he kept going. He forgot the warning. Or perhaps he remembered it perfectly and made a different choice. The same kind of choice that Achilles had always made. The choice of the burning moment over the careful calculation. He pushed forward toward the walls of Troy themselves, toward the place Achilles had told him not to go. And there, on the plain before the walls of the city, with the afternoon sun beginning to fall and the dust of 10,000 feet still hanging in the golden air, the god Apollo found him. Apollo, Troy's protector, Troy's divine patron, struck Patroclus from behind. The helmet flew from his head. The spear fell from his hand. He stood for a moment, dazed, the invulnerability of Achilles' armor, suddenly unable to protect a man who was not Achilles in anything but appearance. And Hector's spear found him. Patroclus fell. The sound that did not happen, the sound that existed only in the night air on the Greek beach, miles from the battle, was Achilles not yet knowing. He was sitting by his ships, the lyre perhaps still in his hands, the afternoon light on the water, and he did not yet know. But the gods knew. And somewhere in the deep architecture of the story, in the pattern that the fates had always been weaving, this moment had always been coming. This was the thread. This was the cut. The news came at dusk. Antilochus, son of Nestor, the man chosen because no one knew how to be the one to say this, came running across the beach. He found Achilles and fell to his knees and grasped his hands and told him, and then held his hands very tightly because he was afraid of what Achilles' hands might do when the words landed. They landed. Achilles made a sound that Homer describes, and the description has never been improved upon in 3,000 years. He fell to the ground. He took the dark dust in his hands and poured it over his golden hair. He tore at his clothes, and he cried out. Not words, not a speech, not the controlled and articulate fury of the assembly, but something wordless, something that came from somewhere beneath language, something that the women in the tents heard and came running out to witness, and then wept themselves, because some sounds carry the whole weight of human grief without needing to explain it. Thetis heard it from the sea. Of course she did. She rose from the waves with all her sisters, the Nereids, 50 silver daughters of the sea, and they came up onto the shore, a procession of grief so beautiful and strange that the soldiers who saw them could not quite believe their eyes. And Thetis took her son in her arms, there on the beach where he had been sitting for so many proud and stubborn days, and she held him while he wept, and she knew, she had always known, that this was the beginning of the end, not just of Patroclus, of everything. Because she knew what Achilles would do next, and she knew what would follow after that. "My child," she said to him, and these are among the most quietly devastating lines in the Iliad. "Why are you weeping? What pain has touched your heart? Speak it, do not hide it. Zeus has accomplished what you prayed for. The Greeks have suffered in your absence. They have needed you and found you gone." And Achilles said, and feel how this lands, how different it sounds from everything he said before, from all the speech about honor and prizes and going home. Achilles said, "My mother, what does any of that matter now? Patroclus is dead. He was the man I valued above all others. I loved him as my own life. He is dead. And I sat here. I sat here while he died." And then, after a breath, after a silence that the Aegean itself seemed to hold, "I will go back. I will find Hector. And after that, let whatever is to come, come. I do not care about going home. I do not care about the long life. I will have my grief and my revenge and my glory all at once, in the same moment, at the walls of Troy. And whatever comes after that is already written, and I am done pretending I can change it." Thetis looked at her son's face, at this face she had looked at in the River Styx, on the mountain, in the harbor at Aulis, across every year and every mile of this long, terrible story. And she saw that the choice was finally, fully, irrevocably made. Not for glory, not for any of the reasons she had always feared, but for love, for the simplest and most human of reasons, for grief so complete that the prospect of his own death became genuinely secondary. She told him she would bring him new armor because Hector had taken his from Patroclus's fallen body. She told him to wait just one night. She would go to the forge of Hephaestus on Olympus and ask the divine smith to make him something worthy of what was coming. She left before dawn, and Achilles sat at the water's edge through the long dark hours, alone with what he was feeling, while the stars moved slowly overhead and the sea breathed its ancient, indifferent breath. And somewhere in the distance, behind the walls of Troy, a city that did not yet know what was coming prepared for another ordinary day. It would be the last ordinary day for a long time. There is a particular quality to grief in the hours just before dawn. If you have ever sat with it, and most of us have in one form or another, you know what I mean. The world becomes very simple. All the complicated architecture of ambition and pride and social calculation collapses, and what remains is just the fact of the loss, bare and absolute, like a stone in the center of a room from which all the furniture has been removed. There is a terrible clarity to it, and in that clarity sometimes a person discovers what they actually are, beneath all the performance and the posturing and the careful management of how others see them. This is what the night gave Achilles. He sat on the Trojan shore through all the dark hours, and the grief did its work. It stripped him down to something essential, and what it found, beneath the greatest warrior in the world, beneath the rage and the pride and the brilliant fury, was a man who had loved someone and lost him and could not bear it. Just that. Just the most ordinary human thing in the world. His mother had promised him armor. He waited for her the way you wait in the dark for something you cannot hurry. Meanwhile, and this detail matters, because it shows how completely Achilles had been transformed by grief in a single evening, he asked his companion Antilochus to carry a message to the Greek commanders. He wanted Patroclus's body retrieved. The Trojans, understanding the enormous tactical and symbolic value of what Hector had taken, were fighting fiercely over the fallen body on the plain. Menelaus and Ajax the Great, enormous, immovable Ajax, the man who was the Greek army's strongest shield when Achilles was absent, were fighting to hold it, to bring it back to the ships for proper burial. Because burial mattered. In the ancient Greek world, burial was not merely custom or sentiment. It was a profound religious and metaphysical necessity. A body left unburied or denied proper funeral rites meant a soul that could not cross the River Styx, could not find rest in the underworld, but would wander instead in a kind of liminal misery, neither fully dead nor able to return to life. For Achilles, whose whole world had contracted to the single point of Patroclus, the thought of his companion's soul unmoored and wandering was intolerable, more intolerable in this moment than his own death. Ajax and Menelaus fought through the afternoon and into the evening, surrounded by Trojan pressure on every side, and they held. Slowly, painfully, they brought Patroclus's body back toward the ships. It was one of the great acts of the war, unsung in the way that defensive heroism is often unsung, the heroism of holding ground rather than taking it. They brought him to Achilles, and Achilles washed him. With his own hands, Achilles cleaned the blood and the dust from his companion's body, and this act, so intimate, so stripped of all the trappings of the warrior, is rendered in the ancient sources with a quietness that is more devastating than any battle description. He wept over him. He promised him burial with honor, with fire and ceremony, and the proper rites. He promised that he would not eat or drink until Patroclus was given to the flames. And he kept that promise. But first, the armor. Thetis had gone to Olympus. She had gone to the forge of Hephaestus, and if you allow yourself to imagine it, that mountain forge above the clouds, the fire of divine craft burning in colors that no earthly flame achieves, you understand why what she brought back was unlike anything previously seen on the plain of Troy. Hephaestus was the smith of the gods, the divine craftsman, born lame and cast from Olympus in one version of his myth, self-made and brilliant in all versions. He owed Thetis a debt. She had sheltered him when he was cast out, hidden him in the sea, given him kindness when the gods of his own family had not. And now she came to him with a mother's request, and he did not hesitate. He made the armor through the night. Homer's description of the shield of Achilles is one of the most extraordinary passages in all of ancient literature, a passage that has fascinated philosophers, archaeologists, and poets for 3,000 years. Because Hephaestus did not simply make a shield, he made a world. On its surface, in divine metalwork, he depicted the entire cosmos, the earth, the sky, the sea. 2 cities, one at peace, one at war. In the city of peace, a wedding procession, musicians, dancing, young men and women moving in the firelight, a legal dispute being settled in the public square, elders deliberating, the crowd pressing forward to hear the judgment. In the city of war, an army besieging walls, an ambush by a river, the complex and terrible business of human conflict. Fields being plowed, harvests being gathered, a vineyard at harvest time with young men and women singing as they worked. A herd of cattle, a sheepfold, a dancing floor where young people moved in patterns, as intricate as those the great craftsman Daedalus had once made in Crete. And around the edge of everything, the great river ocean, which the ancient Greeks believed encircled the entire world. Think about what Hephaestus was doing here. He was not merely making a weapon. He was making a statement. He was putting into Achilles' hands, in the form of a shield, a reminder of everything that war is fought to protect, and everything that it destroys. The weddings and the harvests, and the legal disputes, and the dancing and the singing in the vineyards. The whole warm, complicated, irreplaceable texture of ordinary life. He was arming Achilles with the world and asking him, wordlessly, to remember what the world was. Whether Achilles understood the message is a question Homer leaves beautifully, deliberately unanswered. Thetis brought the armor down from Olympus at dawn. She found her son still sitting beside the body of Patroclus, still keeping his vigil, still refusing food and water. She placed the armor before him, all of it gleaming with divine craft, the shield and the breastplate and the greaves and the helmet with its golden crest. And she watched his face. He lifted the shield. He turned it in his hands, and the firelight of the camp played across the images Hephaestus had made, the cities, the fields, the dancers, the ocean at the edge of everything. And for a long moment, he simply looked at it. What he thought in that moment, the ancient sources do not tell us. Homer moves quickly past the looking, but we can imagine, in the particular freedom that storytelling allows, that something in those images registered, something about what he was carrying, what he was about to do, what it would cost. Then he put the armor on, and the transformation, as Homer describes it, is immediate and total. The Achilles who had been sitting in grief on the shore, weeping, refusing food, washing his companion's body with bare hands, that Achilles is still there, underneath. He always will be. But the armor covers him, and the warrior comes back to the surface, and the surface is terrifying. He called the assembly. The Greeks came at his summons with something that was probably indistinguishable from the outside, from relief, but was actually more complicated than that. They had watched their greatest warrior sit on the beach for weeks while they bled and died on the plain. They had watched the Trojans reach the ships. They had sent embassies and been refused. They had fought without him and found painfully how much of their collective confidence had been built on the foundation of his presence. And now he was back. But he was not back in the way they might have expected. He was not back with the arrogant, burning pride that had withdrawn him from the fighting in the first place. He was back with something heavier than that, something that the ancient Greeks would have recognized immediately as a different order of determination. Not the determination of a man who wants to win, but the determination of a man who no longer particularly cares about the cost. He stood before the assembly, and he did something completely unexpected. He apologized. Not with full political grace. He was still Achilles, still incapable of the diplomatic softening that Odysseus might have managed. But he named the quarrel with Agamemnon, and he said that it should never have happened, that the anger had served no one, and that he was ending it. He was returning to the battle. The cause that had kept him on the shore, his own wounded pride, his stolen time. He was setting it down, not because it had become unimportant, but because something else had become more important. He was not sure, he said, that the fates and the anger of Zeus had not arranged all of this precisely so that Patroclus would die. And if that was so, then his own pride had been the instrument of his companion's destruction, and he would carry that knowledge for whatever days remained to him. It is one of the most honest speeches in the ancient world. It is the speech of a man who has looked at himself clearly in the worst possible light and not looked away. Agamemnon, to his credit, accepted it. He returned Briseis. He offered all the prizes he had promised through the embassy: the gold, the tripods, the horses, everything. He even offered an oath that he had never touched Briseis, as if that mattered at all now, as if any of the material prizes mattered at all now. Achilles accepted them with barely a glance. He was somewhere else already in his mind, standing on a plain outside a city wall, looking for Hector. The Greek commanders tried to make him eat. He refused. Odysseus, practical as always, argued that men fight better on full stomachs, that the army needed to eat and rest before going out, that there were logistical preparations to be made. Achilles listened to all of this with the patience of someone sitting through a storm they cannot change. The gods intervened, because of course they did. Zeus sent Athena to sustain Achilles through the fast, infusing him with ambrosia and nectar, the divine food and drink, so that his body would not fail from what his will refused to provide. It is a small mercy, perhaps the only one available in this part of the story. He went out onto the plain of Troy, and what happened next is what Homer was building toward through the entire length of the Iliad, the Aristeia of Achilles, the moment of supreme excellence, the warrior at the absolute peak of what a human being with almost divine gifts can do in battle. The word Aristeia in Greek refers to a hero's finest hour, their moment of peak performance in war, and Homer structures the Iliad so that several heroes have their Aristeia in sequence: Diomedes, Agamemnon, Hector himself. But Achilles's is the last, the longest, and the most terrible. And terrible is exactly the right word, because what came out of the Greek camp that morning was not quite the Achilles who had raided 23 cities in the early years of the war. That Achilles had been magnificent and fierce and effective. This Achilles was something different. The grief had done something to the calibration of his fear, which is to say, he no longer had any. A man who has already chosen death, who has consciously, explicitly, with full knowledge of what he was choosing, set aside the possibility of going home, does not fight the way a man fights who is trying to survive. He fights the way weather fights, impersonally, completely, without the small self-preserving hesitations that keep most men from the most dangerous places on a battlefield. The Trojans saw him coming and felt it immediately. Homer tells us that the god Hephaestus, at Hera's request, drove back the river Scamander, which had risen against Achilles in an astonishing episode where the river itself, conscious, divine, furious at the bodies being poured into it, rose in a great wave to drown him. This moment in which a mortal man fights a river and the river loses is one of the most extraordinary in the entire Iliad. It speaks to something important about how the ancient Greeks understood Achilles at this point in the story. He has become so entirely himself, so completely committed to his course, that even the natural world cannot stop him. Even a god in the form of a river rises against him and fails. He moved across the plain like a fire across dry grassland. The Trojans broke before him. Some ran for the river, some ran for the walls, and some, the ones whose courage or fate did not allow them to run, stood and fought and fell. Among those who fell was a young man named Lycaon. And the encounter between Achilles and Lycaon is one of the passages that modern readers sometimes find most difficult most uncomfortable, and most honest. Lycaon was a son of King Priam, taken prisoner by Achilles in an earlier raid and ransomed back to Troy by his father. He had been back in the city only 12 days when Achilles found him again on the plain, unarmed, crossing the river. He fell to his knees and begged for his life. He said, "I am your suppliant. I ate at your table. You ransomed me once. Have mercy." And Achilles looked at him, and what he said is stripped of all the expected heroic rhetoric. He said, "Before Patroclus died, I had mercy in me. I took prisoners. I ransomed men. There was still room in me for that. But Patroclus is dead now, and something in me died with him, and the mercy died too. Die." It is a brutal moment. It is also an honest one. It does not ask us to approve. It asks us to understand, to see how grief, when it is large enough, can hollow out the spaces in a person where compassion used to live. This is not presented by Homer as heroism. It is presented as tragedy. Achilles knows what he has become. He says so, plainly. He is not proud of the absence of mercy. He simply cannot find it. He moves on. The gods on Olympus watched what was happening on the plain and argued with each other, because that is what gods do. Apollo attempted to interfere several times, drawing Achilles toward a false pursuit, trying to protect the Trojans through divine misdirection. Zeus watched with the particular melancholy of someone who can see all outcomes simultaneously and finds no comfort in the knowledge. Hera and Athena pressed forward on the Greek side. Ares moved restlessly, unable to settle. The Trojans fled toward their walls. The great gates of Troy opened to receive the streaming flood of survivors, a moment of chaos and desperate compression. Hundreds of men trying to get through a space designed for orderly movement. The gates open only as long as they dared, with Achilles coming behind. And in that compression, in that desperate scramble for safety, Hector made his decision. He stayed outside. King Priam had watched from the walls, had seen what was coming across the plain, had seen his men broken and running. And he had called down to Hector in terms of desperate paternal anguish. "Come inside. Do not face this man. You cannot face this man in the state he is in. You are my greatest son, the protector of this city and all its people. And if you fall here, there is no protection left for any of us. Come inside." His mother Hecuba had added her voice. She had wept and pleaded, and Hector had heard them both, and had stood there outside the gate, and had not moved. He was reasoning through it, Homer tells us. Actually reasoning, working through the logic of his situation in a way that is almost painful to witness because it is so human and so clear. He had led the Trojans out to fight. He had encouraged them. He had told them they could push the Greeks back, could burn the ships. He had been wrong. Men had died because of his decisions. And now, what? Go back inside the walls and face the shame of it? Let his own pride in not wanting to be seen to have been wrong trap him outside the gates, alone, facing the one man he could not defeat? He knew he couldn't defeat Achilles. Homer makes this clear. Hector is not deluded about the encounter he is walking into. He considers alternatives, even imagines briefly whether he might simply lay down his weapons and negotiate, offer to return Helen and all the Trojan treasure besides, make whatever peace might be possible. He considers it and dismisses it because he knows, with the particular lucid resignation of a brave man in an impossible situation, that this is past negotiation now. Achilles is past the point where negotiation means anything. So Hector waited. until Achilles came close enough for him to see his face through the visor of that divine helmet, close enough to see the particular quality of what was in that face, which was not rage in any ordinary sense, but something colder and more complete than rage, something that had burned through rage and come out the other side into a territory for which there is no clean word in any language. And then Hector's courage, which had been enormous and genuine, failed him, and he ran. He ran around the walls of Troy 3 times, Homer tells us, 3 times around the entire circumference of the city, with Achilles behind him, and the Trojans watching from the walls, parents, siblings, wife, child, and the Greeks watching from the plain, and the gods watching from Olympus. 3 circuits of a city, 2 men, one of them chasing his own death, and one of them running from it but unable to stop. It is one of the most cinematic passages in all of ancient literature, and it achieves its power not through the action itself, but through what it means. That even the greatest Trojan hero, in the presence of what Achilles had become, could not hold his ground. Then Zeus lifted his golden scales and weighed the fates of both men. This is Homer's image for what the gods saw, and the scales tipped toward Hector. Apollo withdrew his protection. The machinery of death engaged. Athena appeared to Hector in the form of his brother Deiphobus, standing beside him, offering to fight alongside him. Hector turned, relieved, heartened, and reached out his hand, and his hand closed on something that wasn't there, and he understood. The god had deceived him. He was alone. He had always been alone in this moment. He turned to face Achilles. What he said in that last moment is preserved in Homer with the kind of precision that suggests it mattered enormously to the tradition. That this exchange between 2 men on the verge of one's death was considered so important that it had to be kept exact. Hector asked for an agreement. Whoever wins, the body of the loser will be returned to his people for proper burial. Let us at least have that much decency between us, even here. Achilles refused. He said there were no oaths between lions and men. He said that Patroclus lay unavenged. He said whatever Hector might wish, it would not happen. His body would not be returned. Then he threw his spear. Hector dodged it. For a single heartbeat, the outcome trembled on its hinge. Then Achilles took the second spear, the one Athena had invisibly retrieved and handed back to him, and aimed for the gap in the armor. The place where the shoulder meets the neck. The place that Patroclus's borrowed armor, stripped from the fallen body, and now worn by Hector, had left exposed. It was precise. It was over very quickly. Hector fell, and the dust of the Trojan plain rose around him, and for a moment the world was very quiet. And then Hector spoke. Even dying, he spoke. He said, "I beg you, return my body to my father. He will give you a ransom, bronze and gold, whatever you ask. Let my parents see me buried. Let Andromache see me buried." Achilles said, "Do not speak to me of ransoms. If I could, I would eat your flesh raw for what you have done. Dogs and birds will have you. Your body will rot before these walls." Hector said, "I know you. I know what you are. I know that golden nature has not touched your heart. But remember this, a day is coming for you too. Day is, Paris will find you. Apollo will guide his hand. You will fall at these same walls." Achilles said, "I know it. When it comes, I will meet it. But first, you die." And Hector died. His last breath went out of him into the afternoon air above the plain of Troy, and the soul of the best of the Trojans descended toward the darkness of the underworld, and the war that had seemed, with Hector alive, to have something like balance in it, became something entirely different. The Greeks ran forward and gathered around the fallen body, and each man among them struck it, a ritual of collective victory that modern sensibility finds disturbing, and Homer presents with unflinching accuracy because he is not writing propaganda. He is writing truth. He shows what war does. He shows both the courage and the ugliness, side by side, without comment, and lets the reader carry the weight of both. Then Achilles tied Hector's ankles to his chariot, and he drove. He dragged the body of Hector around the walls of Troy, around the city that Hector had given his life to protect, past the gates where his parents had pleaded with him not to stand and fight, past the section of wall where Andromache had been standing when she heard the cry go up from the Trojan women and understood, before anyone told her, what it meant. She had fainted at the wall, Homer tells us. She had fallen like a person falling from a great height, which is exactly what had happened to her. Fallen from a world with Hector in it to a world without him. And the drop was immeasurable. Achilles drove his chariot 3 times around the walls, and the Trojans watched from above, and Priam watched, and Hecuba watched, and somewhere in the women's quarters, Andromache was being revived, and was beginning to understand that the wall of her life had fallen, and everything she had depended on was dust. He brought the body back to the Greek camp and laid it face down in the dirt beside the tomb of Patroclus. This is not a heroic image. Homer knows this. He gives it to us plainly, without the shield of epic glorification, because the Iliad is not a poem about the glory of war. It is a poem about the cost of war, the human cost, the full and terrible and unromanticized cost. Achilles at this moment is the greatest warrior in the world, and he is also doing something deeply wrong. And Homer shows us both truths simultaneously and trusts us to hold them both. The funeral of Patroclus was magnificent in the way that Bronze Age funerals of great men were magnificent, enormous, costly, excessive, in the way that grief is excessive, refusing to accept that any amount of ceremony can be proportionate to the loss. Achilles cut his own hair over the pyre, the hair he had been growing since childhood as a votive offering, promised to the river god of his homeland, Phthia. He cut it now and placed it in Patroclus's hands, a childhood promise redirected, a piece of himself given to the dead. He held games afterward, funeral games, contests in athletic skills, and chariot racing and archery, with prizes distributed to the competitors. This was the custom, and Achilles honored it fully, even with unexpected grace, mediating disputes, making generous decisions, finding in the management of this ceremony something that allowed the grief to have a container, a form, a ritual shape that gave it somewhere to go. But every morning, before the camp was fully awake, he would rise and drive his chariot around the tomb of Patroclus, dragging Hector's body behind him. He did this for days. The gods watched, and even those who had supported the Greek cause were disturbed by it. Apollo complained to the assembled Olympians that Achilles was violating the most basic principles of human decency, that Hector had been a pious man, a man who had honored the gods properly, and he deserved the dignity of burial. Other gods agreed. The body, by divine protection, was not decaying. The gods kept it preserved, clean, unmarked by the abuse being done to it. Because even if the gods could not stop Achilles' grief, they could at least protect the vessel of another man's grief from desecration. And Zeus, patient, burdened Zeus, who had been watching all of this since the golden apple fell, made a decision. He called Thetis. He told her, Your son has had his grief. He has had his vengeance. Hector is dead. The war is changed forever. But what he is doing now, this daily circuit of desecration, this refusal to let the dead rest, this the gods will not allow to continue. Tell Achilles that Priam is coming. Tell him to receive the old man with honor. Tell him it is time to remember that even enemies deserve the right of burial, the mercy of grief, the right to weep for their own dead. Thetis went to her son, and Zeus sent Iris, the rainbow goddess, messenger of Olympus, to Troy, to the shattered palace of Priam, to find the old king in his grief and give him the courage and the direction to do the most extraordinary thing that anyone in this story does. We will meet Priam in the next chapter, because what he does deserves its own space, its own attention, its own quiet moment in the telling. What he does is the pivot on which the entire moral weight of the Iliad turns. What he does is the thing that brings Achilles back, not to victory, not to purpose, not to the warrior's path, but to his humanity. Priam had been a great king. This is important to establish before we go further, because by the time we meet him in this chapter, this central, pivotal, quietly devastating chapter that many scholars consider the moral heart of the entire Iliad, he is not a great king anymore. He is an old man in ruins. He is a father who has watched his best son fall on the plain outside his city. Watch that son's body dragged in the dirt. Watch the city he has governed for decades begin to understand that its protector is gone, and that the end is no longer a distant abstract possibility, but a real and specific and approaching thing. Priam had 50 sons when the war began. 50 sons and daughters, and a wife, Hecuba, formidable and sorrowing, and a city of extraordinary wealth and beauty, and the respect of the surrounding world, and a life that had, despite the long, grinding weight of the war, still retained a kind of dignity. By the time our chapter opens, 19 of those 50 sons are dead. Hector was the greatest of the living ones, the one who had held everything together, the one whose presence on the walls and on the field had made the difference between the city surviving and the city falling. With Hector gone, something structural in Troy had given way. Not the walls, not yet, but something interior, something in the psychological architecture of the place, in the confidence of its people, in the belief that survival was still possible. Priam felt all of this. He felt it the way old men feel the cold, in the bones, in the deep places, in the middle of the night when there is nothing between you and the truth of things. He had been sitting with his grief for days. The ancient sources and Homer's depiction give us a portrait of a man in the most abject state of mourning, lying on the ground of his palace, refusing to rise from it, covered in the dust he had thrown over himself in the initial moment of learning his son was dead. His surviving sons and his wife and his court all gathered around him, unable to lift him from it because the thing that had laid him there was not amenable to lifting. Some griefs are like that. They have weight without substance, heaviness without physical cause, and the only way through them is the long way. And then Iris came, the rainbow goddess carrying Zeus's message. She came to Priam in his grief, and she told him, Zeus has seen what is happening. The gods are displeased with the treatment of Hector's body. Achilles will be prepared to receive you. Go to the Greek camp. Go alone with a single herald in the night. Bring ransom gifts for the body of your son, and go without fear, because Zeus will send Hermes to guide you safely through the enemy camp, and Achilles will not harm a suppliant. Go alone. in the night into the camp of the man who killed your son. Hecuba's reaction to this plan, when Priam told her what he intended, is one of the great moments of pragmatic maternal fury in ancient literature. She said, with the clarity of a woman who has already lost too many children to have patience for further sacrifice, "What god has put this madness in your mind? You want to go alone to the ships of the Greeks, to look into the eyes of the man who killed Hector, who has been dragging your son's body in the dirt every morning. He will kill you. He is violent and not to be trusted, and grief has made him unpredictable. Stay here. Weep for Hector from here. That much at least is safe." Priam heard her, and then he said something that has the quality of a man who has gone so far into grief that the other side of it has a strange clarity. He said, "I know all of that. I know the risk. I know he might kill me. But Hector is lying in the dirt outside our walls, and his soul cannot rest until his body is burned, and I will not sit in this palace and let that continue. If I am to die, let me die trying to bring my son home. There is a particular kind of courage that has nothing to do with fearlessness. It is the courage that knows the danger and goes anyway, not because it doesn't feel the fear, but because the love is larger than the fear." This is what Priam had. And it is, in many ways, the most human form of courage there is. More human than the rage-fueled fearlessness of a warrior who has decided he doesn't care about dying. More human than the cold calculation of a tactician who has determined that the odds are acceptable. Just a father with his ordinary human terror, choosing to walk toward the thing that terrifies him because his child needs him to. He loaded 12 mule carts with treasure, gold and bronze and finely woven garments and cups of exceptional craftsmanship, not because he was purchasing his son's body like a market transaction, but because the offering of gifts was the ancient language of respect, of genuine engagement, of saying to another person, "I come to you not as a supplicant in weakness, but as a king in honor," bringing what a king brings to a serious encounter. The gifts were a form of dignity for both of them. Hermes met him at the edge of the Greek camp in the form of a young man, a young Greek soldier, slight and pleasant-faced, moving through the dark with the easy confidence of someone who belonged there. He guided the old king and his terrified herald through the sleeping camp, past the guards, past the fires, past all the ordinary dangerous machinery of a military encampment in wartime, until they came to the place where Achilles' shelter stood apart from the others, near the shore. The mules stopped. Priam got down from his cart. He walked into the tent of the man who had killed his son. What happened in that tent is the scene that the entire Iliad has been building toward. Everything before it, the golden apple, the assembly, the withdrawal, the grief, the armor, the Aristeia, the death of Hector. All of it has been preparation for this room, this night, these two men. Achilles was at table with two of his companions when the old man entered. He had eaten. Finally, after days of refusing food, the ritual of the funeral games had loosened something in him enough to allow it. He was still raw with grief. The grief was not less than it had been, but it had perhaps found a container, a temporary form, and in that form it was slightly less ungovernable than it had been in the burning days, just after Patroclus fell. Priam crossed the floor of the tent and fell to his knees before Achilles. And he took Achilles' hands in his own, the hands that had killed Hector, the hands that had tied the body to the chariot, the hands that still smelled of war. And he kissed them. This is the image that Homer places at the exact center of gravity of his poem. an old king kissing the hands of the man who killed his son. And Homer gives us the following extraordinary comparison, one of the most startling similes in all of ancient literature. He compares Priam to a man who has killed someone in his own country, who has had to flee, and who comes to the house of a stranger and falls at his feet. And the stranger is astonished because he has never seen someone in such extremity before and does not know what to do. The comparison is startling because it suggests something important, that Priam in this act has gone outside every normal social category. He is a king, but he is behaving in a way that no king would normally behave. He has humbled himself absolutely, stripped away every layer of royal dignity, come down to the bedrock of simple human need. And this, precisely this, is what breaks something open in Achilles. Priam spoke, and what he said has been remembered for 3,000 years because it finds the exact words for the most unbearable human truth. He said, "Remember your own father, Achilles. He is old as I am old, and he stands on the difficult threshold of age, and perhaps the men around him threaten him, and there is no one to defend him from ruin. But at least he knows you are alive. He grieves for you, but he has hope. He wakes each morning knowing that someday he might see you come home. I had 50 sons. I had Hector, and Hector is dead, the one who was my city's protector, my pride, the guardian of his brothers. I have lost him, and I have come here, to the ships of the Greeks, to beg the man who killed him to give him back to me. I have done what no man on earth has ever done before. I have kissed the hands of the man who killed my child." And Achilles wept. He wept for his father, for old Peleus far away in Phthia, aging without his son, waiting. He wept for Patroclus. He wept for everything. And Priam wept beside him for Hector. And the two of them wept together in the tent while the camp was silent around them. And the Aegean breathed outside, and the night held them both. This is one of the most extraordinary moments in all of ancient, perhaps all of human, literature. Because what Homer has done here is something that no propagandist, no writer of simple heroic narrative would ever think to do. He has placed the greatest Greek warrior and the Trojan king in the same grief. He has dissolved the boundary between enemy and enemy with the single solvent of shared human loss. He has shown us that Achilles and Priam, for all the vast difference of their positions, one the killer, one the bereaved father, one the war's great engine, one its greatest victim, are the same in the only way that ultimately matters. They are mortal. They love people. They lose the people they love, and the loss is equally devastating on both sides of any wall. After the weeping, after a long, unscripted, uncalculated time of it, Achilles spoke. He said, "I know what you have suffered. I know what it cost you to come here. Sit down. Let us put our grief aside for a moment, not because it is done, but because grief without rest destroys the body, and even grief must allow for breath." He offered Priam food and wine, and Priam, who had also been refusing to eat, who had been lying in the dust of his palace for days, as Achilles had been sitting on the shore, Priam ate, and Achilles ate. And they sat across from each other in the firelight of the tent, two men on opposite sides of the most famous war in Western imagination, sharing a meal. Homer tells us that they looked at each other, that Priam looked at Achilles and saw how beautiful he was, tall and golden like a god, and that Achilles looked at Priam and saw how old and noble he was, and thought of his own father. There is a gentle, devastating mirroring in this. Priam sees in Achilles the son he has lost, young, magnificent, irreplaceable. Achilles sees in Priam the father he has left behind, old, vulnerable, waiting. Neither of them says this. Neither of them needs to. The looking is enough. Then Achilles said, "Yes, I will give you Hector." He said it without conditions, without demands beyond the ransom Priam had already brought, which he accepted as the gift it was intended to be, rather than as a price. He said he would need 12 days, a truce agreed between them there in the tent, outside all official channels, between two men rather than two armies. 12 days for the Trojans to mourn Hector properly, to hold the funeral rites, to give his soul the passage it needed. After the 12 days, the war would resume, and whatever the gods had written would happen. But for 12 days, peace. Priam agreed, and Achilles personally attended to the preparation of the body. This detail is important, and Homer gives it to him without qualification. Achilles, with his own hands, washed Hector's body and wrapped it in clean linen and placed it in the wagon that Priam had brought. He did this privately, out of Priam's sight, because he understood with a sensitivity that the rage-driven weeks preceding this night had seemed to extinguish, but had not, that the sight of it might be too much for the old man, that watching the hands that killed his son wash his son's wounds might break something that the grief had left intact. There is a word for this kind of consideration, this kind of careful attention to another person's pain. It is not heroism. It is not glory. It is simply decency. Human decency at the most basic and most difficult level, practiced by a man who had been several days away from losing it entirely. He brought the body out and loaded it himself and covered it carefully. Then he came back inside and made a promise to Priam. The truce would be honored. No Greek would bother the Trojans during the 12 days of mourning. He gave his word. And in the ancient Greek world, a man's word given in this kind of sacred context, in the presence of shared grief, in the space of mutual recognition, was as binding as any oath sworn over a sacrificial altar. Priam thanked him. And there is a moment here, a small moment, easy to overlook, that Homer slips in almost quietly. Priam, before he leaves, asks Achilles for a bed. He says, "I have not slept since my son died. I have not been able to close my eyes. But tonight, for the first time, I feel that I might be able to sleep." And Achilles made a bed for him. He made it with his own hands, carried the fleeces and the rugs, and arranged them in the outer room of the tent, out of the wind, and told Priam to sleep there, and told him that he would wake him before dawn, so that he could be gone, before the other Greek commanders saw him and complications arose. An old Trojan king sleeping in Achilles' tent, protected by Achilles, sent home safely before dawn, with his son's body in the wagon behind him. This is the image. This is the one I want you to carry with you into sleep tonight, because it is the image that contains everything the story has been trying to say. Not the blazing Aristeia, not the divine armor catching the morning sun, not the chase around the walls or the weeping on the shore. This, an old man and a young man, enemies by every measure that the world they inhabited would recognize, sitting across from each other in a tent, sharing grief and bread and the temporary grace of mutual recognition. Let me linger here a moment longer, because the historian in me wants to say something about this scene and what it means beyond its immediate narrative function. The encounter between Priam and Achilles in Book 24 of the Iliad has been called by classicists and philosophers across centuries one of the most morally sophisticated passages in ancient literature. The philosopher Simone Weil, writing her great essay on the Iliad in 1940, surrounded by the very specific horror of the Second World War, identified Homer's poem as one of the only pieces of literature she knew that looked at force, at the machinery of violence and war, without either glorifying it or sentimentalizing it. She saw in the poem a clear-eyed acknowledgement that force degrades everyone it touches, not just the defeated, but the victorious, not just Hector, but Achilles. And that the moments of grace in the poem, the moments where human dignity reasserts itself against the grinding machinery of conflict, are precious precisely because they are so rare and so fragile and so easily destroyed. The meeting of Priam and Achilles is one of those moments. It does not solve anything. The war will continue after the 12 days. Troy will fall. Priam will die, brutally, at the altar of his own palace, killed by Achilles' own son Neoptolemus in the final sack of the city, which Homer does not describe, but which the later tradition preserves with merciless clarity. Andromache will be taken as a slave. Astyanax, Hector's infant son, will be thrown from the walls. The coldest possible logic of ancient warfare, which held that the sons of great enemies must not be allowed to grow into avengers. None of this is undone by one night of shared grief in a tent. But the night happened. The recognition happened. Two men looked at each other across the greatest possible divide, killer and bereaved, victor and vanquished, Greek and Trojan, and saw in each other the same thing: mortality, love, loss, the irreducible human core that no amount of armor, divine or otherwise, can fully protect. And Homer considered that worth writing down, worth preserving, worth sending forward through every century between his time and ours, across the collapse of Bronze Age civilizations and the rise and fall of classical Greece and the expansion of Rome and the burning of Alexandria and the long medieval centuries and the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and the Industrial Age and the terrible modern centuries, and all the way to this particular night, this particular darkness, this particular person listening. Because the thing he found in that tent, the thing Achilles found, and Priam found, and Homer found, is not specific to ancient Troy. It is not specific to warriors or kings or divine armor or prophesied deaths. It is specific only to being human, which means it belongs to everyone who has ever been human, which means it belongs to you. You have lost people, or you will. You have sat with grief in the dark hours, or you will. You have encountered someone on the other side of a divide that felt absolute and uncrossable, and perhaps you have found a moment of recognition there, a moment of seeing the same loss in different eyes, the same fragility in different hands. That is the Iliad. That is what Homer built from the ruins of the Bronze Age, from the fragments of the oral tradition, from the strange alchemy of poetic genius working on the raw material of human experience. A mirror, 3,000 years old, that still reflects something true. Priam was woken before dawn, as Achilles had promised. Hermes guided him back through the sleeping camp, out through the perimeter, onto the road that led to Troy. The sky was beginning to lighten at the edges, that first pale gray that precedes the actual dawn, the light that has no color yet, that belongs to neither night nor day. The road was empty. The mules moved quietly. Priam sat in the wagon beside his herald, and behind them, wrapped in clean linen in the wagon bed, Hector was coming home. He crossed the plain. the gates of Troy opened, and what followed, the lamentation of Troy for Hector, the formal mourning that Homer describes in the final books of the Iliad with a beauty that is almost unbearable, is one of the great pieces of elegiac writing in any language. 3 women speak over the body in turn. First Andromache, his wife, who holds his head and speaks to him as if he might still answer, who tells him what his death means in the most practical and devastating terms. You have left me a widow, and your son an orphan, and Troy will fall now, and I know what happens to the wives and children of fallen cities. She is not wrong. She knows everything. She speaks it anyway, because love requires speaking truth, even when truth is monstrous. Then Hecuba, his mother, who speaks of how the gods have protected his body even in death, how Apollo kept it beautiful, kept it from corruption, and finds in this small divine mercy something to hold on to. The gods cared for him, even at the end. He was not abandoned. Then Helen. Helen speaks last, and her speech is perhaps the most surprising. She speaks of Hector's kindness to her, the only person in Troy, she says, who was never cruel to her, who never blamed her for the war, who always spoke to her with courtesy and defended her when others did not. Troy has always judged Helen in every version of the myth, judged her as the cause of everything, the original sin of the whole catastrophe. And Hector, who had the most reason to hate her, having paid the highest price for her presence in his city, had chosen instead to treat her with human dignity. Helen weeps for him. Her tears are genuine. They carry the particular weight of someone mourning the one person who saw them clearly and did not condemn them for what they were. The lament goes on for 9 days, and then the fire, and then the bones gathered and placed in a golden urn, wrapped in soft purple robes, and set in a grave, and a great burial mound raised over it. And then Homer tells us in the very last line of the Iliad, thus did they perform the burial rites for Hector, tamer of horses. The poem ends there, not with a Greek triumph, not with the fall of Troy, not with Achilles' death, which everyone who listened to the poem knew was coming, but which Homer chose not to include. He ends with a burial, with a Trojan funeral, with the dignified farewell to the enemy who deserved dignity, with the acknowledgement that the man on the other side of the wall was a man, and his death was a loss, and his people's grief was real grief, and the world was diminished by his absence from it. It is a remarkable choice. It is the choice of a writer who understood something that the war makers and the propagandists and the glory seekers rarely understand, that the measure of a civilization is not how it treats its victors, but how it treats its dead, all of its dead, on both sides of every wall. And Achilles? Achilles in the days after Priam's visit was changed in ways that are subtle and difficult to name precisely, but that anyone who has ever been through the worst kind of grief and come out the other side will recognize. He was quieter. The burning that had been in him, the all-consuming forward momentum of rage and loss, had not disappeared, but it had shifted into something slightly different, something that still had fire in it, but fire with a different quality, steadier, less explosive, more like the low and constant heat at the center of something that has been burning for a very long time. He had done something in the tent with Priam that he could not undo. He had recognized himself in an enemy's father. He had felt the pull of his own mortality reflected in an old man's face. He had, in some essential way, come back to himself, not to the self of before Patroclus died, that self was gone forever, but to a self that was recognizably human in ways that the weeks of rage and desecration had threatened to eliminate entirely. He knew that his death was close. He had always known it in the abstract way that the prophecy allowed. That distant formulaic knowledge that every child who grows up with a fate carries as a kind of background awareness, present but not urgent, the way you are aware of the horizon without always looking at it. But now it felt different. Now it felt close and specific and real, not terrible, just real. He had made his choice. He had made it when he stepped out of the women's quarters on Syros and picked up Odysseus's sword. He had reaffirmed it when he sent Patroclus out in his armor, and the worst happened. He had confirmed it irrevocably when he stood before the Greek assembly after Patroclus's death and said, "I will go back. Let whatever comes, come." He was at peace with it, or something close enough to peace that the distinction barely mattered. The ancient sources tell us various things about Achilles' final days. Quintus of Smyrna, writing centuries after Homer, and the fragments of the lost epics preserved in later summaries give us glimpses of what the tradition held. He fought on. He killed Memnon, the Ethiopian king who came to help Troy, himself a son of a divine mother, in a battle that mirrored in many ways the encounter with Hector. He pushed forward toward the walls, and then, somewhere near the Scaean gates, Paris drew his bow. Apollo guided the arrow. It found the ankle, the one place, the single point where the love of a goddess who could not let go had left the door open. Achilles fell. But we will save that, the falling, and what it means, and what it left behind, for the fifth and final chapter, because this fourth chapter belongs to the tent, to the old king and the young warrior, to the meal shared in the firelight, to the recognition that crossed every boundary the world had built between them, to the choice Achilles made in the presence of Priam's grief, to be human again, fully human, for the last time, in the time he had left. Let that image hold you now. Two men in a tent, enemies, grieving, fed, seen. The night outside is vast and dark and patient, the way the best nights are. The nights that hold you without asking anything of you, that require only that you be present in the darkness, breathing, resting, letting the day's armor come off piece by piece until only the essential thing remains. You are the essential thing, not the armor, not the titles or the roles or the wounds that are still open or the ones that have closed over imperfectly. Just the thing underneath all of that, warm and breathing and real and mortal, and therefore in the way that the Iliad insists upon from its first word to its last, precious. The 12 days of the truce pass the way all truces pass, too quickly, with the particular bittersweet quality of time that is borrowed from the inevitable. In Troy, the mourning for Hector was conducted with full ceremony. The women wept, and the men were silent, and the pyres burned, and the bones were gathered and placed in the golden urn that Priam had kept for this purpose, though he had hoped never to need it for this son, this particular irreplaceable son. The burial mound was raised, the earth was smoothed over it, and then the Trojans came back to their walls and looked out at the Greek camp and knew that the borrowed time was over. On the 13th day, the war resumed. Achilles went out onto the plain, and the Trojans felt it again. That particular atmospheric shift, that change in the quality of the air over the battlefield, that told every man on both sides that the ground itself had become different from how it had been during the truce days. Not safer or less safe exactly, just different, weighted differently, as if the plain of Troy had a memory and knew what had happened on it before and was bracing for what was coming now. In the days that followed, Achilles fought with the particular quality that had characterized him since the death of Patroclus, that steadiness, that absence of the flinching self-preservation that ordinary mortality produces in ordinary men. He was not reckless. He was not suicidal in any small or desperate sense. He was simply and completely present in each moment of battle, without the interior reservation that most warriors maintained, that small portion of the self held back against the possibility of retreat. He had nothing held back. Every part of him was forward, engaged, committed. He killed Memnon. Memnon deserves a moment in the telling because his story mirrors Achilles' own in ways that the ancient tradition clearly found meaningful and worth preserving. He was the king of Ethiopia, the son of Eos, the goddess of the dawn, and a mortal father. Another half-divine warrior, another son of a divine mother who had given him gifts beyond the ordinary human measure. Another man whose death would be mourned by a goddess who could not protect him from it. He came to Troy to help Priam to honor an obligation, to fight for what he believed in. He was magnificent by every account, tall and dark and blazing with a warrior's competence and courage. He and Achilles met on the plain. The gods watched, Eos and Thetis, two divine mothers, both knowing what the scales of Zeus would show, both unable to change it, both watching from their respective voids, one of sea, one of dawn light, while their sons engaged with each other on the dusty ground below. The ancient sources describe Zeus lifting his golden scales again, weighing the fates of the two warriors, and this time it was Memnon's thread that the Moirai cut. He fell, and Eos wept. The dawn goddess wept, and her tears became the morning dew. This is one of the most quietly beautiful aetiological myths in the ancient tradition, that the dew you see on grass in the early morning is the tears of a divine mother mourning her heroic son. Every morning the grief is renewed. Every morning the dew appears. The ancient world did not separate the natural and the emotional in the way that we sometimes try to do. Everything was connected to everything else. Every dawn, every drop of moisture on every blade of grass, every shaft of morning light was embedded in a story, carried meaning, participated in the ongoing conversation between the human world and the divine one. Thetis watched Memnon fall and understood with absolute clarity that her son was next. Not immediately, not in the next moment, but soon. The scales had spoken for Memnon, and they would speak again. And when they did, the thread that would be cut was the one she had been watching since before he was born. The thread she had tried to strengthen in the Styx, the thread she had tried to hide on Syros, the thread she had spent his entire life trying to preserve and had, in the end, merely accompanied to its appointed ending. She did not go to him. There was nothing left to say that had not already been said, and nothing left to do that had not already been done. A mother who has spent her child's entire life preparing for a loss can only, in the final moment, stand witness. She had been witness to all of it. The river, the mountain, the ships, the plain. She would be witness to this too. It happened near the Scaean gates. The Scaean gates, the western gates of Troy, the gates through which Hector had marched out to his death, the gates before which so much of the war's significant action had taken place, had a symbolic weight in the ancient tradition that went beyond their function as an architectural feature. They were a threshold, a boundary between the protected interior of the city and the exposed and deadly exterior. A place where the inside world and the outside world met and could not quite reconcile. Achilles was pressing forward, as he had been pressing forward for days. The Trojans were falling back. The walls were close. He was closer to the walls of Troy than he had ever been, perhaps closer than any Greek warrior had yet come with the intent and ability to do real damage to what lay behind them. The momentum was absolute and electric, and felt to everyone watching like the approach of something conclusive. Paris was on the walls. Paris. Let us spare a moment for Paris, because he has been largely absent from our story, and that absence is itself a kind of characterization. Paris was the cause of the war, his choice at the wedding, his acceptance of Aphrodite's gift, his taking of Helen. All of this set everything in motion. And yet throughout the war itself, he appears in the sources as a figure who fought when pressed, but who preferred the walls to the plain, who was better with a bow than a sword, who was beautiful and magnetic, and fundamentally unsuited to the grinding, brutal work that his choice had initiated. Hector, in the Iliad, speaks to him with barely concealed contempt, not for cowardice exactly, but for the particular irresponsibility of a man who makes enormous choices and then leaves others to bear their consequences. But Paris had one gift. He could shoot. He stood on the walls with his bow in his hands, his particular weapon, the weapon of distance, the weapon that kills without the engagement that a sword requires. The weapon that the heroic tradition of the ancient world regarded as somehow less honorable than close combat precisely because it operated from safety. Apollo stood beside him, or perhaps Apollo was simply in his hands, guiding the angle of the bow, adjusting for wind and distance, and the moving target below with divine precision. Paris drew the string. He aimed. He loosed. The arrow crossed the distance between the wall and the man in a fraction of a second. A fraction of a second that the ancient tradition stretched across millennia of retelling. A fraction of a second that became one of the most examined and reimagined moments in all of Western literary history. The arrow flew true. Apollo guided it, and it found the ankle. The one place, the single point of mortal flesh on a body that was otherwise as close to immortal as a human frame could be. The place where a mother's fingers had been, holding him above the sacred river, unable to let go. The place where love, by its very nature, had left the door open. Achilles fell. Now let me tell you something important about this moment, because it matters how we understand it. The death of Achilles is not described by Homer in the Iliad. Homer ends his poem with Hector's funeral. The actual death of Achilles, the arrow, the ankle, the falling, comes from other sources. From the fragments of the lost epic called the Aethiopis, from later summaries and compilations, from Quintus of Smyrna's Post-Homerica, from Ovid and Virgil, and the whole long tradition of classical literature that worked with Homer's material after him. The wound to the ankle specifically, the connection between the death wound and Thetis's method of protection in the Styx, is most clearly elaborated in these later sources, particularly in the Roman tradition. But even within Homer's poem, the death is anticipated so thoroughly, so completely, that its absence from the text functions almost as a kind of presence. Achilles tells us he will die. Hector tells us he will die. The prophecy tells us. Thetis tells us. The entire architecture of the poem is built around the knowledge of this death, the way a room is built around a fire that hasn't been lit yet. The space is there, The preparation is made. The purpose is clear. When the Iliad ends with Hector's funeral, every listener in the ancient world understood that the next fire would be Achilles' own. He fell near the Scaean gates, and the Greeks around him, the men who had fought beside him, who had been afraid of him and awed by him, and relieved by his presence and bereft by his absence. Those men rushed to protect him, to stand over his fallen body the way Ajax and Menelaus had stood over Patroclus. Ajax the Great carried the body. Ajax, who had been the wall of the Greek army in Achilles' absence. Ajax, who was the second greatest warrior among the Greeks and had lived his entire campaign in that particular difficult position. The massive, reliable, loyal, slightly overlooked man who stands in the shadow of someone more blazing than himself. Ajax carried Achilles from the field. The ancient sources describe Thetis arriving with the Nereids to mourn him, the same procession that had come to the shore when Patroclus fell, the 50 silver daughters of the sea, coming again for the same terrible reason, but a different person. She had known this was coming. She had always known. And knowing had not made it easier by a single degree. This is the particular cruelty of prophecy. Not that it gives you information, but that it gives you information without giving you power. And so you carry the knowledge of the thing all the way to the moment the thing happens, and the knowledge is an additional weight on top of the grief itself. She mourned him. She mourned him as only she could, not with the limitations of ordinary human grief, but with the full force of an immortal's capacity for sorrow, which is, by definition, inexhaustible. Mortals grieve, and eventually, mercifully, the grief recedes, not because the love diminishes, but because the mortal frame cannot sustain that intensity indefinitely, and must, for the sake of survival, find a way to carry the loss rather than be consumed by it. Thetis had no such protection. She was immortal. Her grief would not recede. It would go on forever, the way the sea goes on forever, not constantly at its highest intensity, but always there, always present, the undertow beneath every other motion. And yet, and this is the part that the ancient tradition seems to have found most important, she had raised him for this. She had known from the beginning that this was the shape of his life, and the life she had known was coming, the life she had tried to change, and then tried to hide, and then finally had to simply accompany, had been a life of such extraordinary completeness, such compressed and brilliant fullness, that the question of its length seemed, in some important sense, beside the point. Achilles had lived. He had lived with an intensity that most men of long lives never approach. He had loved, completely, with his whole self, without reservation. He had fought beyond the limits of what anyone else could manage, beyond what was strategically advisable, beyond what was safe. He had grieved with the same completeness with which he had done everything else, with nothing held back, nothing managed, nothing sanitized. He had sat with an enemy king in a tent and recognized his own father in the old man's face, and given back a body, and made a bed for someone who by every law of the world he inhabited should have been his enemy beyond redemption. He had been, in the fullest sense, alive. The funeral of Achilles was conducted with all the honor due to the greatest warrior who had ever walked the plain of Troy. His body was placed on the pyre. The flames were lit. And the ancient sources tell us something extraordinary, that the muses came. The 9 muses, daughters of Zeus, goddesses of artistic inspiration, the divine forces behind poetry and music and history, and all the forms of human expression that reach toward the immortal, came to his funeral and sang over him. Think about what this means. The muses sang at the funeral of Achilles. The goddesses of story sang for the man who had become a story. The divine forces of memory sang for the man who had chosen a life worth remembering. It is a beautiful and precise image, the meeting of the mortal and the immortal at the boundary of death, the moment where a life becomes a legend, where flesh becomes song. Because that is what happens to Achilles after the arrow. That is what he had chosen when he stood in the women's quarters of Lycomedes' palace on Syros and reached for the sword instead of the silk. He had chosen to be a song. He had chosen the life that would be worth singing, not for vanity, not for ego, but from some deep understanding that a life lived completely, a life that dares to love and fight and grieve and recognize and make a bed for an old enemy and wash a companion's body with bare hands, that such a life becomes part of the world's permanent inheritance, that it feeds something in every generation that hears it. Homer tells us that the ashes of Achilles were gathered and placed in a golden urn, and that the urn was the same one that held Patroclus's ashes, together in death as they had been in everything in life. This detail, so quietly inserted, so seemingly practical, carries everything. The two of them, the blazing warrior and his gentle, patient, loyal companion, went into the earth together, in the same vessel, inseparable at last, in a way that the living world, with all its divisions and demands, had never quite allowed. The burial mound was raised on the headland of the Troad, the prominent cape that jutted into the Hellespont, the strait between the Aegean and what we now call the Black Sea. It was placed there deliberately so that ships passing through the strait would see it from the water, so that sailors for generations to come would look up from their oars and see the mound of Achilles against the sky and know that they were passing through a place where something significant had happened, where a man had lived and died in full accordance with what he was. The ancient sources tell us that Alexander the Great, 3/4 of a millennium after the Trojan War, sailed to this same headland before his campaign into Persia. He visited the tomb of Achilles. He ran naked around it, as Achilles had run around the walls of Troy. He laid garlands on it. He said, looking at the grave mound of the man who had been dead for 8 centuries, that Achilles had been fortunate to have Homer to sing his story, because without the song, the life would have been lost. Alexander had his own reasons for this thought. He was himself a man who had chosen glory over length, a man who would die young and blazing and be remembered forever. He recognized something in Achilles that was also in himself, the particular hunger of a person who cannot accept the ordinary span of an ordinary life, who must push to the edge of what is possible and then past it, because the alternative feels like suffocation. But I want to offer you a slightly different reading of Alexander's observation. He said Achilles was fortunate to have Homer. And yes, the song matters, the poetry matters, the 3,000 years of transmission matter. But I think what Homer himself would say, if we could ask him, is something more fundamental than that. He would say that the song exists because the life was worth singing, that Homer did not make Achilles immortal. Achilles gave Homer something immortal to work with. The man came first, the completeness of his living, the fullness of his engagement with every experience the world gave him, the willingness to feel everything without deflection. That is what Homer found when he reached into the oral tradition and pulled this story out of it. Something real, something true, something that had happened in the actual world, or close enough to the actual world that the distance between history and legend had collapsed. The song is the record. The life is the thing. And now let me tell you what the ancient Greeks believed happened to Achilles after death. Because the Greeks were not simple in their understanding of what followed mortality, and the tradition around Achilles in particular developed some of the most extraordinary afterlife mythology in the ancient world. In the most common version of the Homeric tradition, the souls of the dead went to the underworld, to Hades, where they existed as pale shadows of their living selves, diminished, drifting, given to drinking the waters of the Lethe, which brought forgetfulness. In the Odyssey, Homer shows us Achilles in the underworld when Odysseus travels there during his long journey home. Odysseus tries to comfort him, tries to suggest that death is not so bad, that Achilles rules among the dead with great honor. And Achilles says something that has echoed through every century since, one of the most famous lines in all of ancient literature. "Do not speak to me of death as a comfort, great Odysseus. I would rather be a hired hand on earth, working for a poor man with little land, than be king over all the dead." This is the honest counterweight to the choice. This is what Achilles himself, in the underworld, says about the bargain he made. That the life, even the hardest, most servant's life, the life furthest from glory, is better than the shadow of it. That being alive, with all its difficulty and limitation and ordinariness, is the only thing that matters. That he would trade it all, the armor, the Aristeia, the legend, the songs of the muses, all of it, for one more ordinary day in the living world. Is this a retraction? Does Achilles regret his choice? I have been thinking about this question for the entire length of our story together, and I want to offer you the answer I have arrived at, which is this. No, it is not a retraction. It is a completion. Achilles chose the blazing life, and he does not unchoose it, even in the shadow of the underworld. What he says to Odysseus is not, "I was wrong to make the choice I made." What he says is something more subtle and more true. That life, any life, all life, even the least of it, contains something that death cannot replicate. That the thing he chose to spend his life in pursuit of, glory, memory, the song, is not a replacement for the living itself. It is an addition to it, a way of extending the warmth of the living moment into the cold of whatever comes after. He chose to be brief and bright rather than long and dim. And in the underworld, he looks back at the brief, bright life and says, "Yes, I would take more of it. Give me more. Not instead of the choice I made. Give me more in addition to it." This is not regret. This is love of life in its purest form, the form that knows exactly what it had and misses it exactly as much as it was worth missing. But the tradition does not leave Achilles in the underworld. The later mythological tradition, preserved in sources including Pindar, the great lyric poet of the 5th century BCE, and in various other accounts, tells a different story about his final destination. It says that Thetis, with the permission of the gods, brought her son from the underworld to the White Island, Lus in the Black Sea, where he lived in a state of blessed immortality. Not the gray shadow existence of the ordinary underworld, but a real and fully alive existence in a beautiful place beyond the edge of the known world, where heroes who had distinguished themselves in life were rewarded with a continuation of it that had all the color and warmth and reality that the Homeric underworld lacked. Some sources say he was reunited with Patroclus there, that the two of them, on the White Island, lived out an existence that the mortal world had always been too small and too short to fully contain. That they ran on the shore of that island the way Achilles had run on the slopes of Pelion as a child, freely with the full use of that extraordinary body, in a place where there was no Troy waiting, and no prophecy overhead, and no mother watching from the sea below with knowledge of what was coming. I cannot tell you whether this is true. No one can. The island is mythological, though there is a real island in the Black Sea called Snake Island, or Zmyny in Ukrainian, which ancient navigators identified with Los, and which even in historical times was associated with the worship of Achilles. Sailors made offerings there. Priests served at a temple. Ships passing through those waters heard, according to the ancient sources, the sounds of celebration coming from the island at night, horses neighing, warriors shouting, the particular sounds of men at games and feasting, and knew that the heroes were still there, still alive, in whatever way heroes are alive, beyond the reach of ordinary mortality. Whether it is literally true is beside the point. What it means is true. It means that the ancient Greek tradition, which had looked at the life of Achilles with absolute clear eyes, had shown every flaw, every cruelty, every moment of diminishment alongside every moment of greatness, had decided, in the end, that a life lived that completely deserved more than a gray shadow in a dim underworld, that the intensity of his engagement with living had somehow earned him a continuation of it. That love as complete as his, grief as real as his, courage as absolute as his, and tenderness as unexpected as his, that these things do not simply stop when the body stops. They go somewhere. They continue in a form we cannot fully specify, on an island we cannot quite find on any map, where the sound of running feet and the smell of the sea and the laughter of someone who loved you carry on beyond the boundary of what we can see from here. And what of Troy itself? Troy fell. It fell in the way that cities fall when the thing that protected them is gone. Not all at once, not cleanly, but in stages, each one worse than the last, until the name became a word for catastrophic ending, and the ground itself was salted with memory. The stratagem of the wooden horse, that brilliant, absurd, legendary solution that Odysseus devised, and that the Trojans, exhausted by 10 years of war, allowed themselves to believe was a gift from the gods rather than what it was, worked. The Greeks poured from the horse in the night. The city burned. The archaeologists who have worked at Hisarlik, the site of ancient Troy, have found the ash layer. They have found the evidence of the fire, the burned timbers, the collapsed walls, the artifacts embedded in destruction debris. The fire was real. The fall was real. The plain where Achilles ran and Hector fell and Priam walked through the dark to ask for his son back, that plain is real. You can go there. You can stand on it. You can look at the Hellespont in the distance and the Aegean beyond that, and understand, physically, in your body, why this particular location mattered, why it was worth fighting over, why it became the center of the world's most enduring story. The walls are mostly gone. The towers are dust. The names of the common soldiers, the ones who neither blazed like Achilles nor stood like Hector, but who simply came and fought and died far from home because their king had sworn an oath. Those names are lost. The plain remembers nothing. The ground does not distinguish between the bones of heroes and the bones of ordinary men. But the story remains. 3,000 years of the story. In every generation since Homer, someone has opened the Iliad and found inside it something that was not there for the previous reader. Some new angle on the same truth, some previously unnoticed mercy or horror or beauty. Philosophers have written about it. Painters have painted it. Poets have answered it with other poems. Novelists have retold it in our own century wonderfully and with great intelligence, from perspectives that Homer left in shadow. Briseis's view, Penelope's view, Cassandra's view, the view from inside the walls. The story keeps generating new versions of itself because it contains something genuinely inexhaustible, something about human nature that does not change with the centuries, that was as true in the Bronze Age as it is in whatever age you are reading this, in whatever darkness you are lying in whatever weariness or peace or private grief you brought with you to this hour. The story is about the choice, not Achilles' choice specifically, though his is the most dramatic version of it. The choice that every conscious mortal being faces, in one form or another, at some point in their life. The choice between safety and fullness, between the long, careful life and the short, complete one, between holding back and going in, between the armor that protects you and the moment when you take it off in front of an old enemy and make him a bed. Most of us will not face it as dramatically as Achilles faced it. Most of us will face it in smaller ways, in the choice to love someone when loving them is frightening, to speak truth when it might cost us something, to stay present with grief instead of managing it from a safe distance, to recognize the humanity of someone we have been taught to see as other, as enemy, as less. To, in whatever small or large way presents itself, choose the real over the defended, the open over the armored, the ankle over the rest of the body. The ankle is the point, not the weakness. The point, the place where you remain mortal, where the love that held you didn't let go, is the place where the story enters, is the place where something real can happen, is the place where, if an arrow finds you, it finds you fully alive rather than sealed away behind divine invulnerability that looks like safety, but is actually another kind of death. The death of the parts of you that can be touched, changed, broken open, transformed. Achilles' ankle is not his flaw, it is his humanity. And his humanity is what we have been following for all 5 chapters of this story. Not the divine armor, not the speed and the strength and the Aristeia, not the fearlessness, his humanity. The boy on the mountain with the lyre, the man who wept at the water's edge, the friend who could not eat when the news came, the warrior who washed a body with bare hands, the enemy who made a bed for an old king in the dark and woke him before dawn and sent him home with his son. That is Achilles. That is the man worth remembering. The stars above the plain of Troy tonight are the same stars, not the same light. The photons that reached ancient Greek eyes are long gone, scattered into the universe, transformed. But the same stars, the same configurations. Orion still stands in the winter sky, the same 3 stars in his belt that Bronze Age sailors used to navigate. The Pleiades still cluster in the shoulder of Taurus, the Pleiades that the ancient Greeks called the 7 daughters of Atlas, who wept for their father's burden and were placed among the stars for their sorrow. Sirius still burns blue-white and enormous, the brightest star in the night sky, rising in late summer over the Aegean, the star the Greeks called the dog star, whose rising they associated with the hottest days of the year. The days of blazing heat, they called, for reasons we still use today, the dog days. The same sky, the same darkness. The same darkness that held Thetis as she watched the fleet sail away. The same darkness that lay over the tent where Priam and Achilles wept together. The same darkness that is around you now, this very moment, as your breathing slows and the story settles, and the long journey across the wine-dark sea comes gently, gradually, to its rest. Achilles is in that darkness too, not as a ghost, not as a gray shadow, not as anything that requires belief in any particular cosmology or afterlife. He is in the darkness the way that any true story is in the darkness, present, available, waiting to be found by anyone who goes looking in the right direction. He is in the word menace, rage, which is the first word of the Iliad, and which contains within it the entire story, the way a seed contains the entire tree. He is in the dew on the grass at dawn, which is Eos weeping. He is in every story ever told about a person who burned brightly and briefly and left a warmth behind that outlasted the burning. He is in every moment of unexpected tenderness between enemies, in every pair of hands that reaches across an impossible divide, in every ankle that remained mortal so that the rest could be divine. He chose this, all of it, the burning and the grief, and the tent in the dark, and the arrow at the gate. He chose it with the same hand that reached for the sword instead of the silk on Syros, and the choice was not a mistake, and it was not a tragedy in the simple sense of an avoidable catastrophe. It was the fullest possible expression of a particular kind of human greatness, the greatness that understands that the measure of a life is not its length, but its depth. Not how long you were here, but how completely you arrived. He arrived completely, and now he rests. Rest now. Let the story dissolve around you the way the light dissolves at sunset, gradually, completely, leaving behind a warmth in the dark that persists after the light itself is gone. The wine-dark sea is very still tonight. The stars are at their highest. The plain of Troy is quiet under the same moon that it has always been quiet under when the fighting stops and the night comes and the living and the dead alike are given over to the darkness and the peace it brings without distinction. You have traveled a long way in this story. You have been to the cave on the mountain and the river in the underworld and the forge on Olympus and the assembly on the beach and the tent in the dark. You have met gods and centaurs and grieving mothers and old kings and the most extraordinary man that the ancient imagination could conceive of, a man who was almost immortal and chose to spend his mortality completely, who was almost a god and chose to be a man, who had every reason to protect himself from loss and chose instead to love without reservation and bear the cost of it with the same completeness with which he bore everything else. You know his story now. It is in you now, the way stories get into people, not as information but as something more like weather, something that changes the internal climate slightly, shifts the light by a few degrees, makes certain things visible that were not visible before. The warmth under the blanket, the weight of your body, the sound of your own breathing, slow and steady and real, the most fundamental proof that you are here and alive and present in the world that you inhabit. That is enough. That is everything. Good night.